Welcome to The Inquiry on the BBC World Service with me, Ruth Alexander. Each week we bring you 4 expert witnesses answering one pressing question from the news. One Tuesday morning in July, I was on my way to work, which takes me across one of the world's most famous shopping streets. You might know it, Oxford Street in London. It's also one of the world's most polluted roads. Watching red bus after red bus pass by, black cab after black cab as I waited to cross, I thought about something I'd heard on the news that morning. The UK government had announced it would ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars by the year 2040, following its neighbour France. India and Germany say they'll do it too by 2030, and Norway and the Netherlands by 2025. I spied a chance to cross, and I always do this. I held my breath as I dashed through the exhaust fumes. 2040, I thought. That's more than 20 years away. Couldn't we all try something more radical? For The Inquiry this week, we're asking, could we ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars now?
Part 1. The Problem.
I realised 15 years ago quite how little we knew about vehicle emissions.
Our first expert witness, James Tate, is from the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds in the UK.
There was very little evidence around. At the time, I was surprised.
He tried to set up a lab to test emissions himself and soon realised why no one knew much about them. It was prohibitively expensive.
It normally costs thousands and thousands of pounds to test one car in a laboratory.
So James Tate continued looking around and happened upon a new, affordable bit of technology that could help him do something rather more interesting: test vehicle emissions in real conditions.
We get an instrument that has a sensing beam that we project across the road. So when vehicles drive through that sensing beam, that beam is scanning through the plume of exhaust trailing a vehicle, and we're able to see for every bit of fuel burnt by a vehicle at that moment how much air pollution it is producing.
James Tate set up the beam across roads in various towns and cities in England and scanned thousands of cars. Back in his office, he crunched the numbers.
I couldn't grasp the significance of what I was seeing.
His tests revealed diesel vehicles were producing much higher levels of pollution than he expected. Every single one of them.
When you look at a 20-year-old diesel car, for example, and you think, OK, so the accumulated mileage on that vehicle is probably 250,000 miles. It's been to the moon and back in terms of mileage. It was emitting the same level as a brand new, straight out of the showroom, new diesel car with perhaps an eco green badge on the back.
Diesel car manufacturers had been saying that their newer models were much less polluting than older cars, but that's not what James Tate's tests showed.
And that's what was really surprising.
He presented his findings at a conference in Brussels.
A couple of colleagues from the motor industry said, James, these results look very compelling, but you can only have tested 5 cars. And I just had to say, well, perhaps you weren't listening to the start of my presentation. There are over 5,000 vehicles in that category.
James Tate's work caused a stir in the industry, but nothing much happened until...
So let's be clear about this. Our company was dishonest. And in my German words, we have totally screwed up.
This is a top executive at one of the world's biggest car makers, Volkswagen, admitting the company had been cheating exhaust emissions tests for its new diesel vehicles. The scandal, dubbed Dieselgate, in the end engulfed not just Volkswagen, but almost all the major car manufacturers, whose diesel vehicles were all emitting more harmful pollutants than their official figures suggested. When Dieselgate broke, what did you think? I told you so.
Yeah.
Millions of drivers around the world have bought diesel cars over the past couple of decades, believing they were cleaner than petrol models. And James Tate says that's added up to a serious problem.
We're breaking air quality standards across the world. Any big urban centre in Africa, they're breaking air quality standards. Paris is breaking these air quality standards, Berlin, Munich, Madrid, Barcelona. Air quality standards being broken right across the US, from Los Angeles, in Denver, New York, right across South America as well.
The list is horribly long, and James Tate says it really matters.
This is shortening people's lives. There's estimates that toxic air in the UK causes 50,000 early deaths a year.
As many as 50,000 people could have their lives cut short because of the effects of air pollution. And that's just in the UK, one small country out of many.
In terms of kind of public health, it is a real emergency, because when you put these numbers alongside road accidents, deaths from passive smoking, obesity, these are all important public health issues, but they aren't at the same level as the air pollution situation at the moment.
The air pollution situation is much worse.
Much worse, but action has been all too slow.
It's not only cars that cause air pollution, lorries do too, so do factories, power stations and more. However, James Tate says traffic in built-up areas creates a particular intensity of pollution. And as several governments now say they'll ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars over the next few decades, car makers too have been lining up to announce their electric futures. Volkswagen says it'll build electric versions of every model in its range by 2030. Volvo says all new models will have an electric motor in 2 years' time. BMW, Jaguar Land Rover and Honda have made similar pledges.
Electric cars will make a huge difference.
Could we ban petrol and diesel cars now?
Not right now, without there being a huge financial penalty to the motor industry, but I think we could do it a lot sooner.
So what would it take to go fully electric?
Part 2. Catch me if you can.
In 2007, I drove a Norwegian electric car. This was a quite small car, but really cute.
Our second expert witness, Christina Boo, the Secretary-General of the Norwegian Electric Vehicle Association, remembers the first time she drove an electric car.
The range was, of course, not the best. And I actually miscalculated and had to stop at a petrol station, asked to have some electricity. Of course, at that time, there were no charging stations. So they lent me a long cord so I could charge from inside the petrol station.
So they gave you a long lead, but what was that attached to?
That was just a normal plug, yeah.
10 years ago, when Christina Boo was making that first journey, electric cars were a novelty. Now in Norway, they're a phenomenon.
We now have about 125,000 fully electric cars on Norwegian roads, and that is close to 5% of all passenger cars.
5%? That might sound like a small number, but the vast majority of Norway's electric cars have come onto the roads in just the past 7 years. In a very short space of time, Norway has become the country with the biggest proportion of electric cars in the world. And another 60,000 cars are hybrid, running on both battery power and traditional fuel.
Norway never had a big master plan behind this. It happened a little bit by chance.
Thanks to the Norwegian taxman.
It's important to understand that Norway is a little bit special when it comes to car taxes. We love taxing cars. The more polluting and the heavier the car, the more taxes, and it can be quite steep. So buying a new car in Norway is very expensive.
Not if it's electric. Zero-emission vehicles are exempt. They're also exempt from VAT.
So this means that these cars actually compete price-wise.
If a car model is available as both fuel engine and electric, in Norway, the electric will be cheaper. And there are other perks.
You don't have to pay at toll roads with an electric car. Public parking is free in quite a few of the cities. Another incentive that has been important, especially in the beginning, has been access to the bus lane.
So electric car drivers can use the bus lane. That's like every driver's dream, isn't it?
Yeah, time is money, you know.
And Christina Boo says Norwegians are having a lot of fun in their electric cars.
I get the red light, and next to me, a Porsche stops. And I know I'm going to beat that car.
The Porsche.
Yeah, because even though it's just a normal looking electric car, it doesn't have any gears. It's an instant acceleration that makes it a lot more fun to drive.
Until your battery runs down, which Christina Bu says tends to happen after 200 to 300 kilometres. If you ever get frustrated in petrol queues, spare a thought for Norway's electric car drivers.
In the most populated areas, queuing at fast chargers is becoming a problem. To charge up to about 80% capacity for an electric car takes about 25-30 minutes.
So those queues for chargers could be really long and tedious then?
Well, of course.
The government is installing more chargers. Private businesses are too, shops wanting to entice drivers in for the half hour their vehicles charging. Norway may have become a world leader in electric cars by accident, but now
Norway has very ambitious goals. It's decided in Parliament that from 2025 we're only going to sell zero-emission cars in Norway, and that's only 7.5 years from now.
Could Norway ban petrol and diesel cars now?
That's a discussion. Politicians say that this is a goal that we will reach, and we will use the measures we have to reach it. And that is, of course, our tax system. They will just tax the petrol and diesel cars out of business.
That would be an interesting move for a country whose great wealth has been built on oil. And Norway's wealth does make it a special case, as does its abundance of hydroelectric power and small population of just 5 million people. Could a ban on the sale of petrol and diesel cars work in a bigger, less developed country like China?
Part 3. Lazy Babies.
I drive from the suburb of my apartment to those downtown region, my office, for 15 kilometers.
Our third expert witness, Zhong Yu, is managing director of the consultancy Automotive Foresight Shanghai Corporation, and he's also a reluctant expert in Beijing's rush hour traffic. His 15-kilometre commute used to take him 20 minutes.
Now it costs you more than an hour, or sometimes 1 hour 20 minutes for this kind of a distance in Beijing in the morning time.
Because Zhong Yu's sharing Beijing's roads with more than 5 million other drivers. A few years ago, the government started to take action to control the number of vehicles and cut pollution in Beijing and China's other bigger cities, to the point where it's now difficult to become a new car owner. You can only buy a new car if you own a car number plate, and you can only get a car number plate by bidding thousands of US dollars in an online auction or by entering a lottery.
I heard now it's about 800 people versus one car plate, which means the chance is almost zero. If you really want to own a vehicle, you need to consider about electric cars. If you buy an EV, this car plate just give you for free.
EV, that stands for electric vehicle. The Chinese government is heavily promoting electric cars.
In China, the pollution is really a problem. China actually has an official plan. By 2020, we want to have a 7% of a total automobiles as new energy vehicles. By 2025, we'll make it roughly 20%. So that's actually already a very aggressive planning.
As well as giving out free number plates for electric vehicles, the Chinese government, like the Norwegians, is subsidising the cost of electric cars.
China give I think the highest subsidy probably in the world. That's almost 30 to 40% of a EV car price in China.
While our last expert witness told us Norway has the greatest proportion of electric cars on the road, China has the greatest number, 1 million, half of those sold in the last year alone. But don't let those numbers deceive you. There are 200 million cars on the road in China in total. Electric cars are still a very small part of the market, but there's clearly an appetite. And the government is said to be thinking of banning petrol and diesel car sales by 2030. But could they do it now?
No, of course not. If European countries can do only by the 2035 or 40, China cannot do sooner than that. Because China has much larger sales volume But in those more inland provinces, they can only afford some kind of a low-priced gasoline vehicles. Electric vehicles are simply too expensive for those people. They cannot afford it.
And that's despite, or actually because of, the generous subsidies.
The car makers, they just rely solely on this subsidy and they can get a really good profit. It means they will really set their retail price very high. So the government realized this is a problem. If they give out just too much money to those car makers, and then they will have a bunch of lazy babies just waiting for the milk, right? So the government tried to say, hey, I will reduce the subsidy very quickly.
And this year it cut the subsidy by a third. And that's not the only challenge facing the electric car market in China. Chong Yu says the fact you can only drive 200 or 300 kilometres before you have to stop to charge up really matters there, especially to the people who make up more than half the market for new cars, first-time buyers.
China is a very large country. A lot of people, young people, want to buy a car, and then they can drive to some far provinces to enjoy their driving experience and the scenery. And also, a lot of young talent people, they are from inland provinces, and then they work in the coastal regions. They want to drive to their hometown. That's sometimes 500 to 1,000 kilometers away. So for them, a long-distance driving is really necessary.
Another thing putting people off, he says, is the total lifespan of electric car batteries, around 5 to 10 years. There is a lot of research into battery technology going on.
Now they are really trying to solve those power density issue and also the cost issue. These two bottlenecks are very quickly solved, but the lifespan of the battery still remains a problem. There's no other new technology, at least today, to have that kind of breakthrough.
If an immediate ban on the sale of petrol and diesel cars isn't going to be practical in the world's most populated country, perhaps it's time for a rethink.
Part 4. The Road Ahead.
My students and I, we sort of banned a few words. We try not to say all people will do this, and then very unwise to use the word never.
Our final expert witness is John Hayward from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the United States. He's written what's considered to be the book on the internal combustion engine, which powers petrol and diesel cars. His reaction to our question?
The car survives for a long time. Many cars have several owners. I think the average is about 3 before the car finally dies. Lifetime's about 15 years. That's almost the same in almost all regions of the world. There's an awful lot of people drive an awful lot of vehicles. And so changing things quickly is just bound to take decades.
Some of your research is funded then by car manufacturers and the oil and energy industry. Some people might say that perhaps you have an interest in saying that the combustion engine isn't dead, that we will still see fuel cars sold in great numbers in the future.
Well, I get that question. We find that our technical and contacts with people in these industries, they know better than to try and influence the outcome of research that I do at a place like MIT.
Lately, John Hayward's been focusing his research on how we can make our transport less polluting. He thinks we will stop buying diesel cars, the worst polluters. However, he's not convinced politicians will win the case for electric over petrol. They're talking about banning the sale of fuel-powered cars. Is that unrealistic to achieve by 2040 or 2050?
Well, my answer is we don't yet know the net positive over long term.
Isn't the net positive that electric cars have zero emissions? We could make the pollution problems in so many of our cities much better.
Well, you cut down on local pollution at street level, yes. But in the net, where does the energy come from? What's the source of the electricity that's going into these vehicles? We've got to have a backup generating system so that the electricity supply is always secure. And that means it can't be completely green. Electric vehicles are the buzzword, and there's good reason, but it's oversold. Unfortunately, we human beings have trouble thinking of more than one thing at the same time. And so electric vehicles are the one thing we think about. But there are some other options.
Starting, John Hayward says, with the traditional fuel engine car. Number 1, tinker with it.
We can improve the technologies, the engines, the vehicles that we're using today. And we can do it quite a bit. We projected about a factor of 2 improvement in their fuel consumption going out to 2050.
You're saying that there's a real possibility that fuel engines could get more efficient?
Oh, I'm convinced they will get more efficient.
Number 2, he says, use them less. Number 3, find a new fuel.
I think we've really got to find a source of liquid fuels that, and it won't necessarily be one source like this kind of biomass or municipal waste or maybe algae. You know, there's lots of choices that are being explored. It's not clear which really have large-scale potential. But if we could find a much greener liquid fuel, then we could continue with our engines. It's not either or. They're going to share the market. It's going to be a mix, and hopefully the mix will get better. We want it to get better. I want it to get better.
It's a case, he says, of being realistic about how viable new car technology is and what people have come to expect from their cars.
It's not the public that's trying to change the engine. It's largely those who are guarding our environment and our politicians. And good for them. This is something we need to do. I'm not saying we shouldn't try. It's just that the solutions sitting around, they're not certainties, not yet. And yet's a very important word.
Could we ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars now? With more than 1 billion cars on the road, an overnight ban would be so impractical as to be impossible. We'll have to wait years until the first governments act, and then years more until the last petrol and diesel cars finally leave the road. How far and fast we go with this is really up to us. We do want cleaner air, but we also want cars that can take us the whole distance. Once we have a taste of the open road, and the freedom that comes with it, we're reluctant to give it back. The inquiry was presented by me, Ruth Alexander. The producers were Sandra Canthal and Serena Tarling, and it was mixed by Rod Farker. You might be interested to know that one of our podcast episodes, What's the Story of Aleppo, has been nominated for a Lovie Award, which recognises the best online content from Europe, so do vote if you want to. And quite separately, you can also vote for what's going to be in the final episode of our BBC World Service podcast series, 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy. Here's Tim Harford.
50 Things That Made the Modern Economy.
Hello. I couldn't stick to 50. I'm going for 51. So what thing should I be making an extra special podcast about? The credit card? Glass? The global positioning system? Irrigation? The pencil? Or the spreadsheet? These are all suggestions that came from our podcast listeners. And now you can vote for which will be the 51st thing that made the modern economy. Vote online now at bbcworldservice.com/51 things, that's 51, where you'll also find full terms and conditions. Voting closes 12 noon GMT on Friday the 6th of October 2017.